What is it?
You're hurt.
It's nothing. We must continue the dance.
The Ashton House ballroom smelled of beeswax and desperation, and Diana Croft was beginning to suspect those two things were not so different after all. She stood near the third marble pillar from the left. She had counted them upon arrival, a habit she had developed over 3 seasons of being systematically ignored. With her shoulder pressed against the cool stone and a glass of lukewarm champagne sweating through her glove. Around her, the machinery of the London season churned at full speed. Silk rustled against silk. Fans opened and closed with the rhythmic precision of musket fire. Young women angled their faces toward the light and their dowry figures toward the ears of eligible men. It was, Diana thought, not so much a ballroom as an auction floor with better music. Her corset was laced a fraction too tight. A silent message from Aunt Josephine, delivered that evening as her aunt's fingers pulled the laces taut with cheerful efficiency. "You are 22, Diana. We are not in a position to be comfortable." Diana understood the mathematics perfectly. A mediocre name, a negligible dowry, and a face that stopped just short of pretty. She had 3 more seasons before the arithmetic became genuinely unkind. She kept her expression arranged into the pleasant blank mask that society required of unmarried women, and watched the waltz rotate. She despised the mask. She despised the entire careful theater of it. Aunt Josephine materialized at her elbow, her eyes fixed somewhere across the room, with a particular quality of intensity that Diana recognized as the hunting look. "Lord Fenwick is making his way toward the refreshment table," Josephine murmured, not moving her lips more than strictly necessary. "If you position yourself near the—" "Aunt," Diana said it quietly, "look at the orchestra." Josephine's gaze shifted, irritated. Then she saw what Diana had already been watching for the past 4 minutes. Near the orchestra platform, in a radius of empty floor that the other guests had instinctively created around him, stood a young man of perhaps 20. He was enormous. The broad-shouldered height of a man built for physical work, dressed in an expensive gray waistcoat that was already slightly rumpled at the lapels. His dark hair fell forward over his eyes. His weight shifted from foot to foot in a restless, private rhythm that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with the music. He was not fidgeting, Diana realized. He was feeling it. His eyes were half closed. His large hands moved against his thighs in a quiet, unconscious percussion that followed the cello line precisely. Lord Oliver Ashton, the Duke of Westford's younger brother. Diana had heard the usual things. Everyone had. The Westford idiot, the Duke's great embarrassment, a man grown with the mind of a child. She had nodded along in drawing rooms and said nothing, which was neither courage nor cowardice, only a failure of imagination she now felt as a small, specific shame. Because looking at Oliver now, she did not see an idiot. She saw a man who had found the only honest thing in the room. "Diana," Josephine said, in a tone that meant do not. Diana was already watching Lord Harrington. She knew his type with the precision of someone who had observed it across 3 seasons in 2 boroughs. Harrington was 26, heir to an earldom, and possessed of the particular cruelty that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He moved through the crowd with his circle of admirers trailing behind him like the tail of a comet, and he was angling, deliberately, incrementally, toward the empty orbit around Oliver Ashton. He held a glass of dark red punch. He was not looking where he was walking. The cold knot in Diana's stomach arrived before the thought did. She set her champagne glass on the pillar's ledge. "I need some air," she said to Josephine. Diana, she was already moving, not running. Running was forbidden, but her strides were long and entirely unladylike, cutting through the crowd at an angle that would put her between Harrington and Oliver before Harrington closed the last 10 yards. She didn't make it in time to prevent the collision. She made it in time to step into the aftermath. The punch hit Oliver's gray waistcoat with a sound like a wet slap. Oliver stumbled forward, his eyes flying open, shock erasing the private joy of a moment before. His hands came up immediately, hovering over the dark red stain spreading across his chest, trembling and not quite touching the fabric. He hated the feeling of wet things. Diana understood this without being told. the way you understand certain truths about people simply by watching them carefully. Good God, man. Harrington's voice carried easily over the music, designed to carry, designed to land. He was brushing his perfectly dry sleeves with theatrical irritation. Watch where you throw yourself. You've nearly ruined my coat. The music faltered. Heads turned. Fans stopped mid-arc. Oliver's breathing had gone ragged. He was looking around the room in short, panicked sweeps, searching for something. The stairs, Diana thought, or his brother, his broad chest beginning to heave. Behind Harrington, three young men were muffling laughter behind white gloves. Perhaps the nursery is missing its favorite pupil, someone said, not quietly enough. Diana stepped directly into the circle of empty floor. She placed herself squarely in front of Oliver, close enough that he was forced to look down at her rather than at the laughing men. She did not look at Harrington. She did not look at the crowd. She pulled a white lace handkerchief from her reticule and held it out toward the stain on Oliver's chest, moving slowly, making sure he tracked her hand before it touched the fabric. "It is entirely my fault," Diana said. Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway, the way a clear tone carries across water, because the room had gone quiet enough to catch it. Oliver blinked at her. His breathing was still ragged, but his eyes had found a fixed point. Her face. Good, Diana thought. Stay with me. So sticky, Oliver said. His voice was a deep, unexpected baritone, hoarse with the effort of containing his distress. Terribly sticky, Diana agreed, pressing the handkerchief gently against the worst of the stain. Punch always is, but it has not reached your shirt, my lord. Only the waistcoat. Harrington stepped forward. Miss Croft, I assure you the fault lies entirely with... Diana turned her head. She did not raise her voice. She did not shift her expression. She simply looked at Harrington with eyes so thoroughly unimpressed that the rest of his sentence appeared to die of embarrassment somewhere in his throat. Lord Harrington, she said, in the tone she might use to observe that it had begun to rain. You appear to have lost your spatial awareness. The terrace is in that direction. The evening air may help. A sharp intake of breath from the nearest matrons. An unmarried woman with a mediocre dowry, addressing an earl's heir in that tone, in this ballroom, with these witnesses. It was social suicide so complete, it was almost architectural. Diana folded the handkerchief into a neat square and returned her attention to Oliver. Harrington left. She felt him go without looking. Better? She asked Oliver. Oliver looked down at his waistcoat. The dripping had stopped. He looked back at her with the direct, unguarded assessment of a person who has never learned to mask his own evaluation. You are not afraid of him. No, Diana said simply. Most people are afraid of loud voices. He said it as a statement of fact, neither approving nor disapproving. I grew up with Aunt Josephine, Diana said. It recalibrates one's tolerance. Something shifted in Oliver's expression. Not quite a smile yet, but the precursor to one, the softening around the eyes that comes before the face commits. He looked toward the orchestra. The cellist had recovered and was moving through the opening phrase of a waltz, a slow, sweeping thing that seemed to fill the room from the floor up. Diana watched Oliver's shoulders ease by a degree. The music was working on him again, the panic receding as the rhythm reasserted itself. Above them on the shadowed staircase, she was not yet aware of the man who had stopped moving. Theodore Ashton, Duke of Westford, stood on the fourth step from the bottom, one hand resting on the banister. He had been in motion, moving toward Harrington with a specific and efficient intention, when the girl in the pale blue gown had cut across his path and rendered the intention unnecessary. He stood very still now. He had watched her step into the empty circle without hesitation. He had watched her speak to Oliver the way no one outside of Theo himself had ever spoken to Oliver. Directly, without the condescension of pity or the sharp edge of discomfort. He had watched her dismiss Harrington with 3 words and then forget Harrington existed within the same breath. She had not looked at the balcony once. In Theo's experience, when women performed acts of conspicuous kindness near Oliver, they did so with one eye on the mezzanine. They wanted the audience. They wanted the acknowledgement. They wanted the Duke's gratitude in a form that could be converted to social currency. This woman had her back to the entire room. She was folding a handkerchief. The waltz swelled into its second phrase. Diana turned back to Oliver. She did not know why she was about to do this. She would examine that question later, in the carriage in the dark, when it was too late to be anything other than honest with herself. She knew only that Oliver's shoulders were already beginning to slump as the other guests drifted back to the dance floor, relegating him once again to the role of a spectator at his own life. "My lord," Diana said. She kept her voice steady. "I find myself without a partner for this waltz, and I have a profound objection to standing still when the cellos are playing so beautifully. Would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" The silence that fell in their immediate vicinity was complete. Oliver stared at her extended hand. His large, calloused hands, the hands of a man who spent hours with small gears and pocket watches, hung at his sides. The panic of a moment ago flickered in his eyes, replaced by a different kind of fear. "I do not know the steps," he said very quietly. "I step on toes. Theo says I am clumsy." "I am entirely indifferent to my toes," Diana replied. She kept her hand extended. "And a waltz is only walking in circles. 1, 2, 3. If you can count to 3, you can waltz." On the staircase, Theo's hand tightened on the banister. Oliver looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he reached out. His grip was nothing like the refined touch of a practiced gentleman. It was the grip of a person who had decided to trust something and was committing to that decision with his whole body. Diana stepped into him, placed his right hand firmly at her waist, and took the first backward step. He stood on her hem. The silk tore with a sound that landed in the silence like a dropped plate. A collective gasp rose from the nearby onlookers. Harrington, near the terrace doors, smirked. Diana did not look down. She tightened her grip on Oliver's shoulder. "Perfect," she said. "Now the left foot. 1, 2, 3. Oliver's brow furrowed into lines of fierce concentration. His lips moved silently, counting. He stepped, did not step on her, and something in his face shifted. He stepped again. They began to turn. It was not a graceful waltz. Oliver moved like something large and careful that had never been given permission to move, stiff with the effort of not breaking what he was holding. He stared at his feet. He counted under his breath, but he was turning. The rhythm was in his feet now, working its way up through his body, and Diana kept her voice in his ear, low and constant. "That's it. Feel the turn. Let the music push you. 1, 2, 3. She did not know exactly when the trembling in his arms stopped. She noticed it the way you notice that rain has stopped. In retrospect, in the silence it leaves behind. Oliver looked up from his feet. He was looking toward the orchestra. His steps, still heavy, still lacking the trained elegance of the Tan-celebrated dancers, had found a rhythm that was entirely his own. He was no longer fighting the music. He was moving inside it. "I am dancing," he said, not to Diana, not to the room, to himself, in a voice full of an astonishment so undefended it was almost unbearable to witness. "You are dancing, Lord Oliver," Diana confirmed. The waltz reached its final phrase. She guided him to a slow halt, holding her position until the last note dissolved, then stepped back and sank into a deep curtsy. Oliver stared at her. His chest was heaving. His hair had fallen entirely over his eyes. He executed a bow of such depth and sincerity that it was briefly unclear whether he intended to stop. When he straightened, his face was open and flushed, and unguarded in a way that the rest of the room would spend the entire evening discussing and entirely failing to understand. Diana rose from her curtsy. Her eyes drifted upward without intention, a pull of awareness she didn't understand yet. On the staircase, fully descended now, standing in a shaft of chandelier light rather than shadow, stood Theodore Ashton. He was not wearing his mask. The hard-lined, cold-eyed Duke of Westford, who had stood above them all at the beginning of the evening, was simply absent. What remained was a man looking at his brother, and then at Diana, with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not gratitude. It was older than gratitude. It was the look of someone who had stopped expecting something and then encountered it anyway. The orchestra struck up a country dance. The crowd surged back into motion. The spell dissolved into the noise of the season, resuming its work. Diana turned away and did not let herself look back. The carriage ride back to Mayfair was silent for the first 17 minutes. Diana counted. She had become very good at counting things that could be quantified in the absence of things that could not. The passing gas lamps cast Aunt Josephine's profile in harsh amber intervals, lit, then dark, then lit again. And each time the light caught her face, Diana could see the ledger being calculated behind her aunt's eyes. Entry by entry, column by column. The final sum arrived at the same answer, regardless of how many times it was recalculated. Ruin. Diana looked at her lap. The tear in her silk hem was a clean one at least. 6 inches along the seam, easily hidden with the right fold. The dress itself could be salvaged into something useful. She had already begun working out the alterations in her mind. If she unpicked the lace border and let the skirt fall straight, it would serve well enough as a morning dress. She found the problem of the dress easier to contemplate than the problem of everything else. "Do you have any conception," Aunt Josephine said at last, "of what you have done?" Diana kept her eyes on her lap. "I prevented a cruelty. You committed social suicide." Josephine turned to face her fully, and Diana saw with a small, weary clarity that her aunt was not angry in the way one is angry at a stranger. She was angry the way one is angry at an investment that has caught fire. There was grief in it, which made it worse. "You insulted the Earl of Danbury's heir. You made a spectacle of yourself dancing with that creature. Diana, the patronesses of Almack's will hear about this by breakfast. We do not have the family name to survive a scandal. We do not have the funds to outlast being cut." That creature, the words sat in the carriage like something spilled. Diana did not react to them. She had learned not to react to the particular cruelties that fell from the mouths of people who were not cruel, who simply had not developed the habit of listening to themselves. "I am aware of the practical consequences," Diana said. "Are you?" Josephine's voice dropped to something tight and controlled. "Lord Fenwick was moving toward us before you intervened. Lord Fenwick, Diana, he may not be Westford, but he has an income, and he is not yet 40, and he was looking in your direction. And now—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked out the window. "We have nothing to fall back on. You know this. I have been honest with you about our situation because I thought you understood." Diana did understand. That was the precise, unpleasant truth of it. She understood the arithmetic in every particular. She understood that her aunt had spent the last 3 seasons managing a campaign with inadequate resources, and that tonight Diana had taken the resources and set them on fire. She also understood that if she had not crossed the ballroom floor, Oliver Ashton would have stood in the center of 500 people and fallen apart completely, and not one of them would have moved. "I am sorry for the embarrassment I have caused you," Diana said carefully. "I am not sorry for the dance." Aunt Josephine made a sound that was not quite a word and pressed herself against the far side of the carriage. She did not speak again for the rest of the journey. The house was quiet when they arrived. The single maid had gone to bed. Josephine went directly upstairs without lighting the candles in the drawing room, which meant Diana was left to find her way in the dark by memory. Past the hall table, 3 steps to the left to avoid the carpet's edge, hand extended to find the doorframe. She did not light a candle. She sat down in the armchair by the unlit fireplace and held very still. The house settled around her. The tick of the mantel clock, a cheap thing, slightly fast that she had meant to have repaired for 2 years, measured out the silence in small, equal portions. Outside, a carriage passed. The sound faded. A temporary convenience, Lady Mercer would say tomorrow. No, Lady Mercer had not said that yet. That was later, at the Richmond estate, at the Earl of Chatham's summer fete. Diana shook her head slightly. She was getting ahead of herself in the dark, assembling futures from components not yet delivered. What she knew right now was simpler and colder. She had 1 remaining season. She had spent a significant portion of her social capital this evening on a boy who felt the music through the floor and called her Miss with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been taught that names mattered. And the man on the staircase, who had looked at her with an expression she could not name, was the Duke of Westford, who had nothing whatsoever to do with her. She sat with that for a long time. The brass knocker at 10:30 the following morning struck 3 times. each impact carrying through the walls with an authority that made the mantel clock rattle on its shelf. Diana was in the drawing room with the sewing basket and the pale blue gown, methodically unpicking the hem. She paused, her needle hovering. They were not expecting callers. Callers did not arrive at 10:30 on the morning after a social disaster, unless they were bringing more disaster with them. She heard the maid's footsteps in the hall, the squeak of the front door, then a low masculine voice that she recognized before she had any right to recognize it. The maid appeared in the doorway with an expression of someone holding something that might bite. She was carrying a silver card tray. On the tray was a card with an embossed crest of such weight and authority that Diana could see the impression it left in the silver from across the room. "The Duke of Westford, ma'am." Diana set down the sewing basket. "Show him in," she said. She stood, smoothed the front of her simple muslin, and decided not to check her hair. Theo filled the drawing room the way weather fills a room. Not loudly but completely, taking up all available space without effort. He was dressed for riding. He smelled of cold air and horse and expensive leather. His dark eyes swept the faded room, the patched rug, the dusty mantelpiece, the sewing basket abandoned on the floor, with the flat, cataloging gaze of a man who has learned to assess environments for risk. Diana did not curtsy. It felt dishonest in her own house, a performance for an audience she did not have. "Your Grace," she said, "this is an irregular hour for a call." "I am not interested in regular hours." He stopped several feet away. The riding crop in his right hand was very still. "I am interested in answers. What were you attempting to achieve last night?" "I prevented Lord Harrington from making a sport of a man who could not defend himself. People do not risk their reputations without a reason. In my experience, charity is invariably transactional." His voice was Oliver's baritone, stripped of all warmth, all the texture that came from not having learned to be careful. "Did you hope to draw my attention? To demonstrate your compassion where I would see it?" The sheer precision of the insult, that it had landed on the exact fear she had examined and rejected the previous night, made her flush hot with something that was not quite anger, but was anger's immediate neighbor. "You flatter yourself," Diana said, and was pleased that her voice came out cold and level rather than sharp. "Your attention was the last thing in my mind. I saw a boy panicking while 500 people stared at him, and I had a handkerchief." She took a step toward him. "Do not project the calculations of your peers onto me, simply because you cannot imagine an action that lacks an ulterior motive. That is a failure of your experience, not a flaw in my character." Silence. Theo studied her the way she had seen him study the ballroom from the mezzanine, with a detached, clinical attention that seemed designed to inventory rather than engage. She held his gaze and did not fidget. "I dealt with Harrington," he said finally. "He left town this morning." Diana absorbed this. She thought of Lady Mercer, who was Harrington's godmother, and made a small mental note that would prove relevant later. That was unnecessary. It was entirely necessary. It also does not address your practical situation. He began to move slowly toward the fireplace. He turned to face her. "The ton will ostracize you. You publicly humiliated a wealthy heir and partnered with the most notorious social liability in London. You are the subject of a considerable number of morning calls today, and I am told none of them are complimentary. I am aware. I will not allow Oliver's happiness to be the instrument of your destruction." He said it simply, without drama, the way one states a fixed principle. "My carriage will come for you and your aunt tomorrow at 3. You will drive with me in Hyde Park during the promenade hour." Diana stared at him. She understood precisely what he was offering. To be driven through Hyde Park by the Duke of Westford in an open carriage, at the height of the afternoon promenade, was a statement that would rewrite last evening's narrative entirely. It was the most powerful form of social endorsement available. It would make her untouchable. "You do not need to pay me for my kindness," she said. "I did not act to earn a debt." "It is not payment." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. A fractional change, barely visible. "It is a consequence. You pulled my brother into the light. You must deal with the glare." He turned toward the door. "Be ready at 3. He was gone before she had assembled a response. Diana stood in the empty drawing room and listened to the front door close. The second time she saw Oliver was a week later, in the glass conservatory attached to the rear of Ashton House. Aunt Josephine, miraculously restored after Hyde Park had restored her hopes, was asleep on a settee in the main salon, undone by the Duke's sherry and the relief of no longer being ruined. Diana followed Oliver through the conservatory door alone. The room smelled of oil, of brass, of damp earth and polish. Spread across 3 long oak tables were clocks, dozens of them, in every state of assembly and disassembly, their gears and springs laid out on velvet cloths with surgical precision. Oliver sat at the center table wearing a leather apron, a jeweler's loop pressed to his eye, a pair of tiny tweezers moving with a care and stillness that was extraordinary in a person who had spent the previous week tripping over furniture. "This one," Oliver said without looking up. He lifted a small brass gear with the tweezers. "The escape wheel. It stops the spring from unwinding all at once. Without it, the clock would run very fast and then stop forever." "It is so small," Diana said. She leaned in, keeping her hands at her sides. "How do you know where it goes?" "I hear it." Oliver removed the loop and looked at her directly. "When a clock is broken, the rhythm is wrong. I look at the gears until I find the wrong one. Then I make it right." "You are a doctor for time," Diana said. Oliver's face broke into a grin so wide and uncalculated that it reorganized his features entirely. "Yes, a doctor for time." He returned to his work. "Theo broke this one." He dropped it on a rock. From somewhere to Diana's left, a dry voice said, "I was thrown from a horse. The watch was collateral." Theo stood with his shoulder against a cast-iron support pillar, arms crossed, watching them. Diana had not heard him enter. He looked different here. Less like architecture, more like a person. The lines of his face had not changed, but they had ceased to be defensive. "You seem remarkably accident-prone for a man of your authority," Diana observed. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the foundation of one. "Oliver is the one with steady hands in this family." Oliver did not look up from his work. "Clumsy," he said simply, as if establishing a fact for the record. Diana laughed. It surprised her. A genuine laugh, not the practiced social variety, rising from the kind of unexpected pleasure that cannot be prepared for. She heard Theo go still beside her. Oliver lifted his head. He looked from Diana to Theo, then back to Diana, with the particular focused attention of someone who has not learned to disguise his observations. "Theo watches you," Oliver said in a tone of calm, factual reporting. "He watches you the way he watches the escape wheel, like you are the part that makes everything work." The conservatory went quiet except for the unsynchronized ticking of 40 different clocks. Diana felt her pulse do something irregular. She kept her expression even. "I am sure your brother watches everyone with equal attention, my lord." "No," Oliver said. He had already returned to his clock with the finality of someone who has delivered a complete truth and considers the matter settled. "He does not." The Earl of Chatham's Somerset sprawled across the Richmond estate like something designed to demonstrate the impracticality of wealth. Acres of manicured lawn, striped silk marquees that would have paid a family's rent for a year, a topiary hedge maze at the garden's eastern edge that the Earl had commissioned from a French designer and clearly never personally attempted to navigate. Diana arrived with Aunt Josephine, who had entered a period of the moderate optimism that Diana was trying not to damage. The Hyde Park drives had done their work with surgical efficiency. The morning calls had shifted in character. Lady Ashworth had acknowledged Diana at the milliner's. It was a fragile thing, this new equilibrium, and Diana treated it accordingly. Present at the correct events, dressed within her means as impeccably as possible, never arriving before the correct hour or staying past it. Theo was inside the house, caught in a political conversation he could not leave without cost. Oliver was in the garden. He had found a colony of stag beetles beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree and was crouched in the dirt with a twig, entirely ignoring the 300 aristocrats drinking champagne 40 yards away. Diana watched him from her position near the rose beds, close enough to intercept any trouble, far enough not to hover. It had become, she realized, a habit she had not consciously developed. Aunt Josephine had located a recently widowed baron near the archery targets, and had departed with the focused energy of someone who has spotted a closing window. An inspiring sight, is it not? The voice arrived at Diana's left shoulder with the sweetness of something that has been left in the sun too long. Diana turned. Lady Mercer stood a few feet away. She was a woman in her late 40s, heavily powdered, her sharp features arranged into an expression of social pleasantry that did not reach her eyes at all. She was Harrington's godmother. Diana had known this since the morning after the ball. She had been waiting, with the patient awareness of someone who knows that a debt will be collected, for Lady Mercer to appear. "The roses are quite robust this year," Diana said. "I was not referring to the foliage." Lady Mercer snapped her fan open with a sound like a dry bone cracking. Her eyes moved to Oliver, still crouched at the base of the oak, absorbed entirely in his beetles. The Duke's burden, playing in the dirt like a feral child. Quite the spectacle. Lord Oliver is observing the stag beetles. Diana kept her voice even. "He has a remarkable eye for the natural world." "He is an idiot," Lady Mercer said, dropping the pretense with the efficiency of someone who has decided the social cost is acceptable. She stepped closer. Her perfume was heavy lavender, the kind that announces itself from 6 feet away. "And you are a very clever little opportunist. Do not imagine the Ton cannot see exactly what you are doing." "I am standing in a garden," Diana said. "I was not aware of doing anything at all." "You are playing nursemaid to snare a duchy." Lady Mercer's voice lowered to a hiss, intimate and precise. "Harrington told me how you positioned yourself. Theo was grateful, naturally. He protects his blood. But do not confuse a bodyguard's gratitude with a man's desire." She paused, letting that settle. "The Duke of Westford will never marry you. You are a temporary convenience, a human pacifier to keep the boy calm so Theo can finally have some peace. Once Oliver tires of you or breaks you, as he breaks everything, Theo will discard you with a small pension and a ruined name." Diana said nothing. She said nothing because she was working out how to say something true that was not a confession, and she had not yet found the shape of it. Because beneath her controlled expression, Lady Mercer's words were finding purchase in the exact places where Diana's own doubts had already been quietly working. Theo had never spoken of the future. He had placed her in his brother's orbit. He had protected her reputation with decisive efficiency. But protection was not the same as desire, and she had not, in the honest dark of too many evenings, been able to prove the difference to herself. She was composing her answer when the world cracked apart. The sound hit the garden like a physical blow, a concussive, detonating crack from the direction of the river, where the Earl of Chatham's pyrotechnics crew had mishandled an early test of the evening's firework display, a rogue mortar detonating on the ground. The aristocrats on the lawn gasped. A woman dropped her glass. The sound rolled across the manicured grounds and hit Oliver with the force of something catastrophic. He did not shout, he screamed. It was not a human sound in the ordinary sense. It was something stripped of self-consciousness, purely animal, the sound of a mind that had been completely overwhelmed by its own alarm systems. He scrambled backward against the roots of the oak, his large frame thrashing, his hands clamping over his ears hard enough to leave red marks. Diana left Lady Mercer mid-sentence. She crossed the lawn at a run, not a careful, ladylike approximation of urgency, but a genuine run, her skirts hauled up in both fists, the gravel of the path punishing the thin soles of her slippers. "Oliver," she called, knowing he couldn't hear her over the ringing in his own head, calling anyway. Oliver was on his feet and moving. He did not run toward the house or toward the crowd. He ran away from everything, blindly, crashing through the gap in the yew hedge at the garden's edge and plunging into the maze. Diana went in after him. The maze swallowed daylight within 6 feet of the entrance. The yew walls rose 10 feet on either side, close-trimmed and impenetrable, closing in with a claustrophobic density that made the air feel thicker. Diana took a left at the first junction. Wrong, dead end. Backed out, went right. The paths doubled back on themselves without logic. She could hear nothing but her own breathing and the muffled sound of the Fates' music, still playing somewhere as if nothing had happened at all. "Oliver." She kept her voice low and steady, the way she had learned to speak to him. Not loud, not soft, Not the condescending calm people use for children, but the voice she used when she was certain of something and wanted him to catch the certainty from her like a temperature. Oliver, the sound has stopped. The powder is gone. A heavy thud from somewhere to her right. She ran toward it, skirts dragging on the gravel, arms out to turn the corners. A sharp twig caught her sleeve and tore the fabric at the elbow. She did not slow down. She rounded a tight corner and stopped. Dead end. U-walls on three sides, close and dark, and smelling of earth and sap. Pressed into the deepest corner, huddled with his knees pulled to his chest and his arms wrapped over his head, was Oliver. He was rocking. Not in the private, music-following rhythm she had seen in the ballroom. This was something faster and less voluntary, his whole body in it, a mechanical repetition that looked like an attempt to maintain coherence through pure motion. He was murmuring, rapid and broken. Numbers, she realized. He was counting, lost somewhere in the count, repeating sections, starting again. Diana dropped to her knees. She did not reach for him. She knew better. A touch right now would feel like an attack. Would be an attack, her hand arriving in his world without context or warning. She placed both palms flat on the gravel in front of her and made herself small. Her weight settled back, her head low. "Oliver," she said, quietly, evenly. It was fire powder, a misfire. The sound is gone. He did not stop rocking. "Broken," he said, very fast. "The sky broke. Theo, Theo." "The sky did not break," Diana said. "It only sounded like it. The sky is exactly where it was." He rocked, he counted. The word Theo surfaced again and again, like something being called up from a very deep place. Diana reached into her skirt pocket. Her fingers found the small, cool weight she had been carrying there since the afternoon in the conservatory. A brass pocket watch, bought from a street vendor near Covent Garden for 3 shillings. It ran slightly fast and chimed on the wrong quarter hour, and she had been meaning to give it to Oliver to fix. She pulled it out. She held it by its short chain and let it swing gently, the pendulum motion catching the faint light that filtered down through the top of the U-walls. She did not speak. She let the tick of it move into the silence, a small, steady mechanical pulse. Tick, 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 10 seconds, 20. Oliver's rocking began to slow, not stopped, still present, still that automatic motion, but slower, the rhythm beginning to find a different frequency. 30 seconds. Oliver's murmuring quieted. He cracked one eye open. His dark hair had fallen completely over his face, and through the tangle of it, he located the swinging watch with the focused attention of someone whose nervous system has found a fixed point to organize itself around. "Is it broken?" he asked. His voice was hoarse and raw. "No," Diana said. "The escape wheel is perfectly healthy. Listen to the rhythm." Oliver lowered his arms by inches. He leaned forward. His entire attention narrowed to the cheap brass casing, the tick of it, the predictable mathematical certainty of its gears turning over in sequence, the logic of it working on him from the outside in, pushing the chaos back by increments. "It is a cheap watch," he said after a long moment. His breathing was slowing. "The mainspring is slightly overwound. I know, I was hoping you might fix it." Oliver reached out. He did not take the watch. He placed his large, still trembling hand over hers and leaned his ear toward the casing, listening with his whole body. He closed his eyes. "Healthy?" he murmured. The rocking had stopped. Diana sat in the mud of the dead end and let herself breathe. She was still sitting there when the shadow fell across the entrance to the dead end. She looked up. Theo stood at the gap in the U-wall. He had clearly run from the main house. His cravat was torn open, his dark coat dusty at the knees from what appeared to have been a collision with at least one hedge junction. His chest was heaving. He had the look of someone who had been calculating terrible possibilities all the way across the estate. He looked at his brother, settled now, ear against a cheap brass watch in a woman's hand. He looked at Diana, kneeling in the mud with her hem destroyed and her hair entirely undone, holding a pocket watch steady so a grown man could listen to its tick. He stood there for a moment without moving. Then he stepped into the dead end, dropped to his knees in the mud beside them, and pulled his brother into a crushing embrace. Oliver stiffened for 1 second, then wrapped his massive arms around Theo's back and pressed his face into his brother's shoulder. "I have you, Ollie," Theo said very quietly, in a voice that had nothing of the Duke in it. "I have you." Diana released the watch chain carefully, leaving the watch in Oliver's palm. She stood up, brushed the worst of the mud from her skirts, and turned toward the exit. They needed the privacy. She understood this without having to think about it. She had taken 2 steps when a hand closed around her wrist. The grip was iron, not rough, not painful, but absolute. She stopped, looked back. Theo was still on his knees with one arm around Oliver, but his other hand had closed around Diana's wrist, and he was looking up at her with an expression that she still could not entirely name, only that it was the opposite of composure and the opposite of the detached, cataloging gaze he had turned on her drawing room 3 weeks ago. He did not speak. He did not need to. His hand on her wrist was a sentence in itself. "Do not walk away from me." Diana stood still. After a long moment, she sat back down in the mud beside them and said nothing at all. That evening, the carriage took her home to the Croft house alone. Josephine had returned to Mayfair earlier with the widowed Baron, which was its own small crisis for another day. Diana let herself in with her key, changed out of the ruined dress without help. The buttons were difficult but not impossible, and put on a plain cotton wrapper. She did not light a candle. She sat in the armchair by the cold fireplace and let Lady Mercer's words come back, because she had been holding them at arm's length all afternoon, and they were going to arrive eventually regardless. A temporary convenience. She sat with it. She did not fight it. She looked at it the way she would look at a garment, to understand how it was constructed, what it was made of, where the seams were, whether it held together under examination. Theo had been deliberate. He had managed her situation with the same decisive efficiency with which he managed everything. Hyde Park, the conservatory, the fete. He had placed her near Oliver and watched the results. He had intervened when necessary. He had never once in any of it said anything that required an emotional risk. The mantel clock ticked its fast, inaccurate tick. Diana looked at her hands in the dark. They were still faintly muddy at the knuckles despite washing. She thought about Oliver's hand over hers, pressing the cheap watch to his ear. She thought about what he had said in the conservatory, in his flat, factual voice. "He watches you like you are the part that makes everything work." She thought about Theo's grip on her wrist in the dead end, the absolute refusal of it. She thought, "I do not know what to do with any of this." She thought, "I am afraid he is only grateful, and I will mistake it for something else." She thought, "I am also afraid that he feels exactly what I think he feels, and that will require me to be braver than I know how to be." The clock ticked. Diana sat in the dark for a very long time. He came in the morning, not at 10:30 with 3 authoritative knocks, 2 quiet taps at the door, barely audible over the kitchen sounds from below, in the manner of someone who has decided that the grand gesture is not the right instrument for this particular moment. Diana opened the door herself. She had been awake since 5, which she considered no one's business but her own. Theo stood on the front step without his coat. He was in shirt sleeves, white linen, open at the collar, which was so far outside the conventions of a morning call that it briefly stripped the situation of all its social grammar and left only the 2 of them, which was either better or worse, she had not yet determined. "Oliver wants to show you something," he said, "in the conservatory. He has been asking for you since before breakfast." A pause. "I want to talk to you." Diana stepped back from the door. Josephine was still asleep. The maid had not yet arrived. Diana poured tea from the kitchen pot, strong, slightly oversteeped, and handed a cup to Theo, who received it with the expression of a man who has not been handed a cup of tea by a woman in her own kitchen before and is not certain of the correct response to this. He drank it without speaking. She drank hers. They walked to Ashton House in the early morning quiet of the street, which was not a thing people of their respective stations were supposed to do, and which neither of them mentioned. Oliver met them at the conservatory door. He was wearing the leather apron already at 8:30 in the morning, and he was holding something, a small brass carriage clock, its casing open, gears exposed in their ordered array on the velvet cloth. "I fixed your watch," he said to Diana. He meant the cheap street vendor watch she had left in his palm the previous evening. He was already wearing it on a chain at his waistcoat. The mainspring was overwound by 4 turns. The escapement arm was slightly bent. I corrected both. It now keeps exact time. He looked pleased with this in the uncomplicated way he looked pleased with things. Also, he added, turning to his clock, I want to show you how the quarter strike mechanism works. It is very interesting. I would like that very much, Diana said. They gathered at the center table. Oliver began to explain, carefully in the particular language of someone who knows a subject so thoroughly that the challenge is not understanding, but translation. How the count wheel controlled the number of strikes, how the lifting pins on the great wheel triggered the hammer, how the entire mechanism was a conversation between moving parts, each one dependent on the precision of the last. Theo stood at the far edge of the table, ostensibly examining a maritime chronometer that was already in perfect working order. Diana was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, not always looking at it, but always knowing where it was. The escape wheel is my favorite part, Oliver said. He lifted the small brass gear with his tweezers and held it toward the light from the conservatory's glass ceiling. It is the part that controls everything without appearing to. It makes the clock seem to pause between each tick. Without it, all the energy would release at once and the clock would destroy itself. He looked at Diana, then at Theo, then back at the gear. That is what you are, he said to Diana, with the calm certainty of delivering a conclusion that he has arrived at through his own methodology. Diana looked at the gear. Her hand was very still on the edge of the velvet cloth. Oliver, Theo said. She stayed when the sky broke, Oliver said, unperturbed, setting the gear back in its housing with precise care. The Richmond maze. She did not run and come back. She did not send someone else. She stayed. He picked up a small screwdriver and began reseating the gear. That is not strategy, Theo. I know strategy. Strategy is when people are very kind to me in front of you and then look to see if you noticed. He turned the screwdriver one careful quarter turn. She was not looking at you. She was looking at the watch. That is not strategy. That is love. The conservatory was very quiet except for the 40 clocks. Theo set down the maritime chronometer. Diana did not look at him. She looked at Oliver's hands steady on the clock, completing the repair with absolute concentration, and thought about whether she was going to say the thing she was actually thinking or the safer version of it. She chose the actual thing. Lord Oliver is right that I was not looking at you, she said, to the air between them rather than directly at Theo. I have spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand why you have done what you have done, and I have been unable to determine whether it is gratitude or obligation or... She stopped, started again. Lady Mercer said I am a temporary convenience, that you needed someone to manage Oliver so you could have peace, and I have been unable to fully disprove it, because you have never said anything that requires you to be... She finally looked at him. Vulnerable, she said. You solve problems. You remove obstacles. You do not say anything that could be held against you. Theo was looking at her with an expression she had been cataloging for weeks and was finally beginning to read. It was the expression of a man confronting something he had been trying to solve by not thinking about it directly. I tried to send Lady Mercer away from London this morning, he said. I know you did, Diana said. She told me in the Rose Garden, before the fireworks. She was quite thorough. And my point is that you manage that situation the same way you manage all the others. You applied force from a position of power and removed the problem. What you did not do is speak to me. I spoke to you. You spoke at me, Diana said, not unkindly. You made announcements. You issued instructions. You solved the problem of my reputation as if it were a shipping contract. I am grateful for all of it. I am also telling you that I have no idea what I mean to you beyond the sum of these solved problems. Oliver, without looking up from his clock. She is telling you that you are being cowardly, Theo. A silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Yes, Theo said. He said it quietly, and it was the least offended thing she had heard him say. I know. He moved around the edge of the table. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly, close enough to see that the hard, calculated composure of the Duke of Westford was simply gone, and what was under it was a person who appeared to have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. I assumed everyone was calculating, he said. I assumed specifically that you were calculating because everyone in my world calculates, and it is the only thing that makes sense. So when you crossed the ballroom, I looked for the angle. When you came to the conservatory, I looked for the angle. When you ran into the maze after him, he stopped. His jaw tightened. There was no angle, and that meant I had no framework for you at all. And that, he exhaled, frightened me more than anything Harrington or Lady Mercer or any of them could have done, because I knew exactly what to do about enemies. I did not know what to do about you. Diana waited. Before you, Theo said, if something happened to me, if I failed, if I fell, the only one who suffered was Oliver. I could not afford to fall, so I did not allow for the possibility. You have made it possible for me to fall. That is not a comfortable position, Diana. It was the first time he had used her name. And yet, Oliver said from the end of the table, turning the finished clock over in his hands to check the casing, you are still standing here. Theo looked at Diana. Diana looked at Theo. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, not like a revelation, but like a mechanism that has been misaligned for weeks finally finding its correct orientation. I have been afraid, Diana said, that I am exactly what Lady Mercer said, a placeholder, a function. You are not a function, Theo said. You are the first thing in my life that I did not calculate. I did not calculate you in the ballroom. I did not calculate what it would cost me to watch you walk into the maze after him. I have not been able to calculate any of it. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, and his hand covered hers where it rested on the velvet cloth. I do not know what to do with you, but I am very certain that I do not want to find out what I would do without you. Oliver set the finished clock down on the table. It began to tick, the quarter-strike mechanism engaging, the count wheel turning in its precise, controlled sequence. Very good, Oliver said to the clock. All healthy. They stood there, the three of them, with 40 clocks ticking around them, and Diana thought about escape wheels and what it meant to be the part that holds everything else to the right speed. They did not hear Lady Mercer arrive. She did not come into the conservatory. She came as far as the half-open door to the garden. Diana heard the voice first, carrying across the conservatory's glass walls with the piercing quality of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. The girl has clearly enchanted him. One does not simply invite a nobody to one's conservatory at dawn without an ulterior motive on her part, and if the Duke cannot see... Diana stepped back from Theo's hand. Theo moved toward the door. Diana stepped in front of him. He stopped. She looked at him for a brief, steady moment. He read it. He stepped back. Diana walked to the conservatory door and opened it fully. Lady Mercer was standing in the garden with two women whose names Diana knew. Lady Ashworth and Mrs. Pemberton, the latter of whom was a patroness of Almack's and consequently one of the 12 most socially consequential women in London. They had apparently been taking a morning tour of the Ashton Rose Gardens at Lady Mercer's invitation. Lady Mercer turned at the sound of the door and had the experience of finding Diana in front of her, which did not appear to be what she had anticipated. Miss Croft, Lady Mercer said. She recovered admirably. What an early hour for a visit. It is, Diana agreed. She addressed Lady Ashworth and Mrs. Pemberton directly. I apologize for interrupting your garden tour. I wish to return this to Lord Oliver. She held up the cheap brass pocket watch on its chain, the one Oliver had repaired this morning. He repaired it for me. The mainspring was overwound and the escapement arm was bent. He corrected both. Mrs. Pemberton, with the expression of a woman who has been navigating these waters for 30 years, said, Lord Oliver repaired it? He is remarkably skilled, Diana said. He has one of the most acute mechanical intelligences I have encountered. He can diagnose a broken clock by sound. She looked at Lady Mercer. I have found in my experience that people who call others simple have generally not spent very much time listening to them. Lady Mercer's expression did several things in rapid succession. I wonder, Diana continued pleasantly, whether your tour also included the conservatory itself. Lord Oliver has assembled some extraordinary timepieces. Mrs. Pemberton, I believe you have an interest in French clockwork. Mrs. Pemberton did in fact have an interest in French clockwork. She indicated this with the warm precision of a woman who has just decided which side of a social moment she is on. I should be delighted, Mrs. Pemberton said. Lady Mercer looked at the three of them. She made a calculation that was visible even to Diana, who was not in the habit of reading calculations in faces. Then she said, in a voice that had contracted to something thin and contained, I find I must attend to another engagement. Lady Ashworth, Mrs. Pemberton, good morning. She left through the garden gate. Diana turned and led Mrs. Pemberton and Lady Ashworth into the conservatory, where Oliver, entirely unaware that anything had happened in the garden, looked up with transparent delight at being presented with a visitor who wanted to discuss French clockwork. The last week of June arrived with the particular quality of London summer that turns the city into a different place. The air softer, the light longer, the parks filling in the early evenings, with people who seem briefly surprised that they live somewhere this pleasant. 3 days after the conservatory morning, Mrs. Pemberton left her card at the Croft house. 2 days after that, Lady Ashworth wrote a note suggesting a musical. These were small things, each one individually insignificant. But Diana had spent 3 seasons learning to read the social weather, and she read them correctly. The ledger had been rebalanced. The disaster of the Ashton ball had been written over by something else entirely. She sat with the news the way she sat with most good things. Quietly, checking it for structural defects before allowing herself to trust it. The morning she was reviewing Lady Ashworth's note at the drawing-room window, Josephine knocked and entered without waiting. This was her standard mode of entry, which Diana had learned to accommodate. Josephine sat down across from her, with the expression of someone who has been composing a speech since before breakfast. The Duke has not formally declared himself, Josephine said. No, Diana said. He has driven you through Hyde Park 3 times. He has invited you to his brother's conservatory twice. He had Lady Mercer effectively removed from his social circle, and yet he has not made a formal, he will or he won't, Diana said. She set down the note. Either outcome is survivable. Josephine looked at her for a moment. You are not frightened? Diana considered this honestly. I am always frightened, she said. I have simply stopped letting it make my decisions for me. Josephine sat with this. Then she said, in a voice that had lost its strategic quality entirely and was simply an older woman talking, You are braver than I gave you credit for, my girl. Diana looked at her aunt, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the permanent slight anxiety in the set of her mouth, the fundamental decency underneath all the calculation. You have been keeping us both afloat for 3 years, she said. I am aware of what that has cost you. Josephine reached across the table and pressed Diana's hand briefly. She did not say anything else. She stood up and left the room, which was more honest than anything she could have said. The Oliver situation arrived on a Tuesday. Oliver appeared at the Croft house front door at 10 in the morning, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle, which turned out to be a bracket clock he had repaired for the drawing-room mantel. He had decided, in the way Oliver decided things, with a complete absence of social calculation, that the Croft drawing room needed better timekeeping, and had acted on this decision without consulting anyone. Mary, the maid who opened the door, responded by going immediately to find Josephine. Josephine appeared in the hallway and regarded Oliver with the expression she reserved for situations that exceeded her existing social framework. Oliver regarded her back with perfect equanimity. I have brought a clock, Oliver said. He indicated the bundle. The one in your drawing room runs fast. I could hear it from the street. Also, the mechanism is old and will fail within the year. I have brought a replacement. He paused. It is a good clock. I made the adjustments myself. Lord Oliver, Josephine said, with the careful politeness of someone dealing with a situation for which the etiquette manuals have not prepared them. It is not quite appropriate for you to call without... Oliver. Diana appeared at the top of the stairs. She came down quickly. Oliver's face shifted into the uncomplicated relief of someone who has located the right person. Diana, I have brought a clock. I see that, Diana said. She looked at Josephine. Josephine looked at Oliver. She looked at Diana. She absorbed visibly and painfully the fact that her niece's name in the young man's mouth had the quality of something deeply familiar. Not a formal Miss Croft, but something he had arrived at through repetition and ease. "I have an appointment," Josephine said, which was probably not true, and left through the parlor door. Diana stood in the hallway with Oliver and the clock. "She does not like me," Oliver said. He did not seem particularly distressed by this. He said it the way he said most things, as an observation, not a complaint. "She does not know you?" Diana said. She took the bundle from him. "Will you show me where to put it?" Oliver spent 20 minutes installing the bracket clock on the drawing room mantel, explaining the mechanism to Diana in the particular language that was his own, and left satisfied with the cheap pocket watch ticking on his chain and a piece of shortbread that Diana had found in the kitchen, and which he ate with the complete, immediate pleasure of a person for whom good food is simply good food. When the door closed behind him, Diana sat in the drawing room for a long time, listening to the new clock tick. It kept perfect time. Theo came at 3 in the afternoon. He knocked twice quietly, and Diana opened the door herself because Mary was doing the laundry, and Josephine had not yet returned from her not quite real appointment. They went through to the drawing room. Theo looked at the new clock on the mantel. He looked at Diana. Something in his expression settled. "He told me he was bringing it," Theo said. "I did not tell him not to." "I know," Diana said. "You would have before." Theo considered this. Yes. He sat down in the armchair opposite her. Not the Duke's posture, not the riding crop in hand posture, but a person sitting in a chair in someone's drawing room on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "I have been thinking about what you said in the conservatory." "Which part?" "The part about not knowing what you mean to me beyond solved problems." He laced his hands together. "You were right. I have been managing. I have been competent in your direction. That is not a substitute for the actual thing." "No," Diana said, "it is not. I have also been—" He paused, began again. When Oliver said what he said, about the escape wheel, he looked at the new clock on the mantel. "He is not wrong. He has never in my experience been wrong about people, even when he cannot articulate his reasoning in conventional terms. He knows something about—" He stopped again. Diana waited. "He knows something about what I feel," Theo said, "because he has been watching me since the night of the ball. He watches because he watches everything, because everything is data to him, because he is trying to understand human beings through observation, since they will not cooperate with being understood directly. And he has been watching me watch you." He looked at her steadily. "So when he says the word love, he is not guessing. He has collected the evidence over weeks and arrived at a conclusion." "And is he right?" Diana asked. It was a direct question. She had asked it on purpose, because she had decided, sitting in the dark of her drawing room 3 nights ago with the cold fireplace and the fast-ticking clock, that she was not going to continue living at the edge of things, looking in. Theo looked at her. "Yes," he said, simply without preamble, without the management of it. "He is right." Diana breathed in, breathed out. "I am afraid," she said, "that I have been waiting for the other version of this to be true, the Lady Mercer version, because the Lady Mercer version requires nothing of me. I could be dismissed, and that would simply confirm what I already half believed about my own value." She held his gaze. "The version where you mean it requires me to believe that I am worth meaning it to, which is a more difficult thing." Theo stood up. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and reached down and took both of her hands in his. Not the iron grip of the maze, not the desperate grip from the dead end, but something deliberate and careful, the grip of someone who has thought about what they are doing. "You are worth meaning it to," he said. "You are not a function. You are not a convenience. You are the person who walked into an empty circle in a ballroom and held the world steady long enough for my brother to learn that he was allowed to take up space." He looked at her hands in his. "I do not know how to say this in a way that sounds like something other than what it is." "Say it like what it is," Diana said. "Marry me," Theo said. "Not because I rescued you, Not because you rescued Oliver. Not as a transaction. He looked up. Marry me because I want to hear you argue with me for the rest of my life, and because Oliver has decided you belong in Ashton House, and his judgment is better than mine, and because you are the part that keeps everything from running at the wrong speed. Diana looked at him for a moment. I have one condition, she said. Name it. Oliver fills every room in Ashton House with clocks. Theo stared at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Not just the precursor this time, the actual thing. A real smile arriving on his face with the quality of something that has been waiting for permission. The house will be insufferable. The house will be entirely on time, Diana said. Theo laughed. It was the sound she had heard once before, in the narrow hallway of her own house. And it was still the same, rich and deep and entirely real, the laugh of someone who has stopped guarding the way they sound. He pulled her into his arms. She let him. She rested her hands against his chest and felt the erratic, hammering pulse of him against her palms, and then felt it, gradually and certainly, begin to settle. The following September, at a small private ceremony at Ashton House attended by Aunt Josephine, in a hat of extraordinary ambition, and Oliver in his best coat with the pocket watch on his chain, Diana Croft became the Duchess of Westford. Oliver stood beside his brother during the ceremony. Afterward, he went directly back to the conservatory, where 3 new clocks were waiting to be assembled. Lady Mercer was not invited. She spent the season in Bath, which suited everyone, and gradually discovered that the social currency she had been trafficking in had quietly devalued without her noticing. She recalibrated, as people do, and eventually settled into a life that was smaller and considerably more honest than the one she had built. This was not Diana's doing. It was the natural consequence of building a position on someone else's weakness rather than your own strength. Mrs. Pemberton remained a friend of the house. She and Oliver had an ongoing correspondence about French clockwork that lasted 15 years and produced a paper on the precision of early Parisian escapement mechanisms that was cited much later by people who had never heard of either of them. In the long drawing room of Ashton House, in the library, in the conservatory, in the upstairs hall, and eventually in the guest rooms and the breakfast parlor, the clocks accumulated. Oliver assembled them with the same focused love he brought to everything, each one chosen for the quality of its tick, each one installed with care, each one a small insistence that time should be marked and measured and attended to. The house was never quiet. Diana, standing in the hallway on a November morning 2 years later, with her boots on and her coat half-buttoned, listening to the overlapping ticks from every direction, thought, this is what it sounds like when everything is working. She went out into the garden to find Oliver, who was cataloging the winter beetles, and sat beside him in the cold and watched him work with his careful, steady hands, and felt entirely, simply present. Some people enter our lives not to fill a role, but to remind us that we are worth being seen. The bravest thing a heart can do is stop hiding behind its own armor long enough to let someone in, not because it is safe, but because the alternative is spending your whole life at the edge of the room, watching the music happen to someone else. And sometimes the person who teaches you this is not the one you expected, but a boy with a leather apron and a pocket watch, who watches the world with the precise, patient love of someone who knows that broken things can always be made to tick again.